Hello and welcome. Whether you're listening in the quiet hours of the night or taking a peaceful pause during the day, this gentle journey invites you to step into a nation standing at a crossroads. Make yourself comfortable, let your breath slow and settle, allow the echoes of conflict to fade into stillness. Together, we'll drift into the fragile calm that followed one of the most defining struggles in American history. This is Reconstruction, after the American Civil War, a serene, reflective exploration of how a divided country began the long process of rebuilding. Take a slow, steady breath. As you exhale, imagine towns resting under soft morning light, battlefields returning to silence, and families cautiously stepping forward into an uncertain future. The war has ended, but its presence lingers in the land, in memory, and in the lives forever changed. In this peaceful retelling, there is no battle, no urgency, only careful observation. We move slowly through the years that followed, noticing how laws, lives, and hopes were reshaped. Picture yourself standing on a quiet road stretching across the countryside. The air is still, carrying the scent of earth and fresh timber. Schools open, fields are worked again, and conversations turn toward freedom, rights, and belonging. Though you remain safely where you are, you may sense the tension and hope intertwined. A nation learning how to heal while carrying deep scars. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore the era of Reconstruction, how freedom was defined and contested, how communities rebuilt, and how the choices made during this time shaped generations to come. We'll move gently through these moments, letting history unfold like a slow sunrise after a long night. For now, settle in, breathe deeply, and allow this calm journey into post-Civil War America to begin. Endings and beginnings. April 1865 at Appomattox. In the gentle Virginia spring of April 1865, the gunfire finally fell silent. On April 9th of that year, General Robert E. Lee rode to a farmhouse in Appomattox County to meet General Ulysses S. Grant and surrender the Army of Northern Virginia. Inside the modest parlor of Wilmer McLean's home, the two commanders, one in splendid ceremonial gray uniform, the other in a mud-spattered Union officer's coat, spoke with cordial respect. There were no triumphal shouts or vengeful taunts. Grant later remembered feeling sad and depressed in that moment. Like anything, rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly. With a quiet handshake and generous terms that allowed Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and personal arms, the bloody Civil War reached its symbolic end. Outside, as word spread that Lee had yielded, weary Union troops began cheering. Their long, harrowing fight was over. Yet General Grant silenced the celebration, not wanting to exult over the humbled enemy. Outside the courthouse, ranks of Confederate soldiers laid down their rifles in stacks and folded their flags. Nearly 4 years of devastating conflict had concluded. Some 750,000 Americans were dead, countless more wounded. Cities and farms lay in ruins. But from the ashes of war arose a fragile hope, a chance to remake the nation in peace and to fulfill the promise of liberty for 4 million newly freed African Americans. In the soft light of that April afternoon, amid the dogwood blossoms and trampled fields, Reconstruction was about to begin. Lincoln's vision of reconciliation. Only a month earlier, On March 4th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln had delivered his second inaugural address beneath the Capitol's half-finished dome. The war still raged then, but victory was in sight. Rather than boast or condemn, Lincoln's words were humble and healing. He urged Americans to finish the conflict with malice toward none, with charity for all, extending firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Lincoln envisioned a reunited country knit back together as one, despite all the wounds of battle. He spoke of binding up the nation's wounds and caring for those who had borne the brunt of the war, both Union and Confederate, soldier and civilian. In that address, delivered under gray skies and cold rain, the president set a tone of forgiveness and restoration. Many listeners were moved by his mercy. One observer remarked that Lincoln's speech sounded more like a sermon than a victory speech, reflecting a desire to welcome the South back without revenge. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction had actually begun to take shape even before war's end. During the conflict, he had formulated the 10% plan, a lenient policy to bring seceded states back into the Union quickly. Under this plan, announced in 1863, if 10% of a state's voters swore loyalty to the Union and accepted the end of slavery, that state could form a new government and rejoin. Lincoln's vision was reconciliation over retribution. He hoped to weaken the Confederacy from within by offering moderate terms to Southerners who would lay down arms early. By 1864 and 65, Union-controlled areas in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee had organized pro-Union governments under Lincoln's terms. These embryonic Reconstruction governments aimed to show that Southern society could be rebuilt peacefully, with emancipation accepted and the Union intact. At the heart of Lincoln's approach was the hope of healing. He famously said, "Malice toward none," and he meant it. The president wanted to avoid harsh punishment of Confederate leaders or ordinary soldiers. He spoke often of restoring the national authority as soon as possible, believing a swift peace would save lives and resources. Lincoln even considered limited suffrage for educated or veteran black men, an extraordinary idea at that time. In fact, on April 11th, 1865, just days after Appomattox, Lincoln gave a speech suggesting that some African Americans, especially those who had fought for the Union, deserved the right to vote. This was a radical departure from past policy and signaled that Lincoln understood the importance of black citizenship in the post-war order. In the audience that night, listening with seething anger, was actor John Wilkes Booth. He reportedly turned to a companion and vowed, "That means citizenship. Now by God, I'll put him through. That is the last speech he will ever make." Within 3 days, Booth's deadly plan would unfold. Tragedy in Washington. Lincoln assassinated. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Americans' fragile hope was shattered by the crack of a pistol at Ford's Theater in Washington. President Lincoln, enjoying a rare moment of leisure at a comedy play, was shot in the head by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. The theater gasped in horror as Booth leapt onto the stage, shouting "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Mortally wounded, Lincoln was carried to a boarding house across the street, where he died early the next morning, April 15th of 1865. A Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, at the president's bedside, whispered sorrowfully, Now he belongs to the ages. The great emancipator was gone, and with him the steady hand guiding Reconstruction's first steps. The news rippled across the nation, stunning North and South alike. In the North, millions plunged into grief. Church bells tolled and black crepe hung from doorways. In the South, many who had cursed Lincoln now felt uneasy about what would come next. Lincoln's assassination was the first murder of a U.S. president, and it struck at a critical time, just as the hard work of rebuilding was to begin. The task of reunifying the country, healing its wounds, and securing freedom's fruits for the formerly enslaved would now fall to Lincoln's successor, Vice President Sir Andrew Johnson. Lincoln's death altered the course of Reconstruction profoundly. He had been a symbol of moderate, forgiving peace. Black Americans especially mourned, fearing the loss of the one man they trusted to protect their new liberty. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass voiced the anxiety of many freed people, saying, "The arm that struck Abraham Lincoln was aimed at the liberty of us all." The question hung heavy in the spring air. Would Lincoln's spirit of charity and commitment to black freedom live on in the policies of the new president? Or would Reconstruction take a different, darker path? President Andrew Johnson's approach. Andrew Johnson took the presidential oath on April 15th, 1865, just hours after Lincoln died. A self-made man from the mountains of Tennessee, Johnson had been the only Southern senator to remain loyal to the Union when his state seceded. Lincoln chose Johnson as his running mate in 1864, partly to send a message of national unity across party and regional lines. Yet despite his Unionist credentials, Johnson was a Democrat with very different ideas about Reconstruction. He was a stubborn, confrontational figure, stiff-necked, some said, with a deep-seated belief in states' rights and a lifelong disdain for the wealthy planter class. As a poor tailor's apprentice, he had resented the Southern aristocracy. But crucially, Johnson was also a pronounced white supremacist. He harbored intense prejudice against black people and little interest in securing their newly won rights. Initially, there was hope Johnson might punish Confederate leaders harshly, given his pre-war rhetoric against traitor planters, and carry forward Lincoln's plans to integrate freed slaves as equal citizens. Radical Republicans in Congress cautiously welcomed Johnson, thinking he might be tougher on the ex-Confederacy than Lincoln would have been. However, it quickly became apparent that Johnson's vision of restoration differed sharply from what civil rights advocates desired. Johnson believed, as he bluntly stated, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." His outlook did not include black Americans in the polity. In May 1865, barely a month into his presidency, Johnson unveiled his presidential Reconstruction policy. It was surprisingly lenient toward the former Confederate states. He offered broad amnesty and pardons to most ex-Confederates who would swear allegiance to the Union and accept the end of slavery. High-ranking Confederates or wealthy planters with taxable property over $20,000 had to seek individual pardons, but Johnson granted these liberally by the thousands. By late 1865, Johnson had personally pardoned hundreds of leading Confederates, including military officers and members of the Richmond government. He allowed the Southern states to quickly hold conventions and reestablish civil governments, dominated largely by the same white elites who had led secession. The only major conditions were that each state nullify secession, repudiate Confederate debts, and ratify the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. In practice, presidential Reconstruction, 1865, 1867, under Johnson, turned out to be extremely forgiving to the South's old order. Johnson did not demand guarantees of black political rights or economic security. He even opposed the idea of black suffrage outright. As one observer noted with alarm, Johnson's policies meant the white South is to regulate its own affairs. Indeed, by the end of 1865, all 11 former Confederate states had convened constitutional conventions and elected new state legislatures under Johnson's watch. Many of those new governments looked disturbingly familiar. The governors and legislators were often ex-Confederate officials or pre-war elites. Alexander Stephens, the former Confederate vice president, was even elected to the U.S. Senate by Georgia's legislature in late 1865, though Congress refused to seat him. This swift restoration of the old political class shocked Northern Republicans, who felt the South was acting as if it had never been defeated. Johnson's indulgence extended to property issues as well. During the war, under Lincoln, some land confiscated or abandoned in the South had been distributed to freed slaves, notably by General Sherman's Field Order No. 15 in early 1865, which reserved coastal rice plantations for black families in 40-acre plots. But Johnson overturned these efforts. In the summer of 1865, he ordered almost all confiscated lands returned to their pre-war owners, including areas where black families had settled. On places like Edisto Island, South Carolina, freedmen who had begun farming their own small homesteads were evicted when pardoned planters reclaimed their estates. A committee of black residents on Edisto Island wrote an impassioned letter protesting that if the government betrayed its promise, we are left in a more unpleasant condition than our former enslavement. From the homes we have lived in the past, they pleaded, we can only do one of three things: step into the public road or the sea, or remain working as in former time and subject to their will. You will see this is not the condition of really freemen, the committee told General Oliver O. Howard, head of the Freedmen's Bureau. Their stark words, landless, homeless, voteless, captured the crisis facing freed people under Johnson's policies. Life in the South for the newly freed. For formerly enslaved African Americans, the summer of 1865 was a season of exhilaration and uncertainty. Emancipation had come, gradually in some places, suddenly in others, and with it the promise of a new life. Families torn apart by slave sales tried desperately to reunite. Freed men and women legalized marriages that had only been informal under slavery. Many couples and parents roamed southern roads in search of children, spouses, or siblings sold away years earlier. The Freedmen's Bureau, a new federal agency created by Congress in March 1865, became an invaluable source of help and hope during this transition from slavery to freedom. Officially named the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, it was tasked with aiding both black freed people and destitute white refugees in the South. By the summer of 1865, the Bureau, under General Oliver O. Howard, had set up offices across the former Confederacy to provide food, clothing, medical care, and legal assistance to those in need. One of the Bureau's greatest successes was education. Northern missionary societies and the Bureau together established over 1,000 schools for African Americans. In dusty church buildings, army barracks, or makeshift huts, black children and adults crowded into classrooms for the first time, thirsting for knowledge. Northern teachers, many of them women, both black and white, journeyed south to teach the rudiments of reading, writing, and arithmetic. They found students of all ages eager to learn. Charlotte Fortin, a black teacher from Philadelphia who taught freed children in coastal South Carolina, marveled at her pupils' enthusiasm. "I never before saw children so eager to learn," she wrote in 1864. "They came to school as other children go to play." Older boys and girls would labor in the fields from early morning until noon, then rush to the classroom still as bright and as anxious to learn as ever. Fortin was astonished by their progress, despite having been so long crushed to the earth under slavery. To her, the very sight of formerly enslaved people striving for education refuted racist claims of black inferiority. It is wonderful how a people who have been so long imbruted can have so great a desire for knowledge and such a capability for attaining it, she observed, noting that any alleged racial inferiority was the result of oppression, not nature. Image: Northern teacher Charlotte Fortin, who taught in a South Carolina school for freed slaves, described her students' intense eagerness to learn. In this 1864 diary excerpt, she notes that coming to school was a constant delight for children who had long been denied education. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped establish historically black colleges, including Howard University in Washington, named for Jenner Howard, and Fisk University in Nashville. By 1870, over 150,000 African Americans were attending Bureau-sponsored schools across the South. Learning to read was not just a personal triumph, it was an act of liberation. At evening, by flickering lamp or pine knot fire, formerly enslaved adults carefully traced letters of the alphabet, spelling out words like freedom and their own names, claiming an identity beyond master's slave. Many also devoured the Holy Bible, finding solace and promise in its verses, now that they could read them for themselves. Economically, however, freedom brought daunting challenges. Emancipation meant that black families could finally work for their own benefit, but they emerged from slavery with nothing: no land, no money, often only the clothes on their backs. In 1865, vast numbers of freed people were roaming or concentrated in camps, surviving on army rations. They hungered not just for food, but for a chance to control their own labor. A widespread aspiration among the freed was captured in the phrase, 40 acres and a mule, shorthand for land ownership that would give independence. During the war, Sherman's Field Order No. 15 had briefly granted black families plots on coastal plantations, raising hopes that land confiscated from rebels would be permanently redistributed. But President Johnson's reversal of those land grants dashed these dreams for many. As the Edisto Island petitioners wrote, being denied land left them at the mercy of their former masters, combined to prevent us from getting land enough to lay our fathers' bones upon. With no land of their own, most rural freed people in 1865 or 1866 had little choice but to work for white landowners. A new system of labor called sharecropping began to take shape. Under sharecropping contracts, black families farmed a portion of a white landlord's land, perhaps 20 to 50 acres, in exchange for a share, often half of the crop at harvest time. The landowner typically provided tools, draft animals, and seed on credit to be paid off from the harvest. In theory, sharecropping gave freed people more autonomy than gang labor or wage work. Families could work their own plot, decide their own schedule, and live in individual cabins. But in practice, it often became a cycle of poverty and debt. Landlords set high interest rates at their plantation stores and paid artificially low prices for crops, keeping sharecroppers perpetually indebted. Still, many freed people preferred sharecropping over the old system of forced labor because it at least felt closer to independence. One formerly enslaved man explained, "Half the crop belongs to me. Now I's own myself and I's got my own home." Yet the reality was harsh. An observer in Mississippi noted that sharecroppers frequently found themselves with no net profit after settling accounts, kept poor as when they were slaves. Urban freed people sought different opportunities. In southern towns and cities, black artisans, barbers, laundresses, and shopkeepers emerged to serve the black community, or even white customers. The Freedmen's Bureau helped some by arranging apprenticeships or teaching trades. Black churches, previously outlawed or tightly controlled, sprang up freely and became centers of community life. By 1806, independent Black Baptist and African Methodist Episcopal AME congregations flourished across the South. These churches were often pastored by dynamic leaders who had been enslaved preachers. They offered spiritual support, education, and a training ground for black leadership. As one South Carolina freedman said, "We had no country and no home except for the church, which became our house, our school, our everything." Amid all these changes, the white South reacted with a mix of grudging acceptance and fierce resistance. Many individual white planters and farmers tried to maintain as much of the old order as possible. As soon as Johnson allowed Southern legislatures to form in late 1865, those bodies, dominated by ex-Confederates and conservative Democrats, began passing laws known as the Black Codes. These were a series of draconian measures intended to control black labor and behavior, keeping freed people as close to slavery's conditions as possible in all but name. The Mississippi Black Code of 1865, for example, required black adults to sign yearly labor contracts under white supervision. Any who left their jobs before contracts end could be arrested and dragged back by force. In many states, black people were forbidden from owning firearms, buying farmland, or even living in towns without proof of employment. Vagrancy laws allowed police to round up black men found idle or without labor contracts and lease them out to white employers to work off fines, a thinly veiled system of neo-slavery. One provision in Mississippi permitted sheriffs to hire out black offenders to any white person who paid their fine, effectively recreating the auction block for those ensnared by trivial offenses. The Black Codes also attacked black autonomy in personal life. Some states restricted African Americans' right to own property or engage in business beyond menial trades. Most prohibited interracial marriage. Mississippi's code even provided that black workers could not leave one employer for another before contract expiration, empowering any white person to capture and return deserters to their employer for a bounty. All the old slave patrol instincts were revived under color of law. To freed people, these oppressive codes felt like slavery by another name. A northern reporter in Mississippi observed that in practice, the new laws would require a Negro to remain in the service of some white person, and if unemployed, the black person can be hired out, and if he resists, can be forcibly taken and compelled to work. Freedom itself seemed under siege. News of the black codes and white violence against freed people began reaching the North by late 1865. Northern soldiers stationed in the South wrote home about the abuses. Freedmen's Bureau agents filed reports describing beatings and injustices inflicted on black families who dared to leave plantations or assert their rights. One Bureau officer in South Carolina reported that white employers were flogging and abusing freed people and that local courts refused to prosecute such cases. In Texas, Major General J.J. Reynolds warned in 1868 that the murder of Negroes is so common as to render it impossible to keep an accurate account. He described armed gangs, like the nascent Ku Klux Klan, roaming the countryside to terrorize black people and their white allies, while civil authorities either participated or looked away. Reynolds concluded grimly that the civil law is almost a dead letter in much of the state, and only the presence of federal troops prevented wholesale anarchy. Such reports deeply alarmed Northern citizens and lawmakers, who increasingly felt that President Johnson's leniency had allowed ex-Confederates to abuse the peace and defy the spirit of emancipation. Congress strikes back. Radical Reconstruction. By the end of 1865, it was clear that President Johnson's hands-off Reconstruction was enabling Southern whites to reconstruct their society on terms scarcely better for black people than slavery. Northerners who had fought and sacrificed to save the Union and end slavery were outraged to see Confederate leaders back in power and freedmen oppressed under the black codes. When the U.S. Congress reconvened in December 1865, the Republican majority refused to seat the newly elected Southern senators and representatives, many of them unrepentant rebels. Instead, Congress formed a joint committee on Reconstruction to investigate conditions in the South. Over the winter of 1865-66, this committee gathered testimony from Bureau agents, Army officers, and black Southerners, revealing the widespread violence and injustice in the former Confederacy. One radical Republican on the committee, Senator Jacob Howard, declared that without further action, the emancipated slaves would be altogether at the mercy of their former masters. A political clash between President Johnson and congressional Republicans was now inevitable. Republicans ranged from moderates, loyal to Lincoln's vision, willing to work with Johnson if he protected basic black civil rights, to radical Republicans, led by men like Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, who wanted sweeping transformation of Southern society, including full citizenship and voting rights for black men. Both wings, however, agreed that Johnson's approach was failing. In early 1866, Congress moved to assert its authority over Reconstruction. They passed a bill to extend and strengthen the Freedmen's Bureau, giving it more power to protect black rights and distribute land. Johnson vetoed it, arguing that extra aid to blacks would breed dependency and that it was unconstitutional to operate such a federal agency in peacetime. Shortly after, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which declared all persons born in the United States, except Native Americans, to be national citizens with equal rights before the law, regardless of race. This act struck directly at the black codes by ensuring black citizens the same rights to make contracts, sue, testify, and own property as whites. It was the first major law in American history to define and protect civil rights at the national level. President Johnson, however, vetoed the Civil Rights Act as well, dismissing it as unwarranted federal interference in state matters and claiming it discriminated in favor of black people, an ironic assertion given the pervasive discrimination against them. This proved a breaking point. Moderates who had hoped to cooperate with Johnson now saw him as an obstacle to justice. In April 1866, for the first time in history, Congress overrode a presidential veto on a major bill, enacting the Civil Rights Act into law with the required two-thirds majority. Johnson's veto had been swept aside. The stage was set for a more assertive Reconstruction policy led by Congress, not the White House. One Republican newspaper proclaimed, "The policy of Congress is fixed. The rights of the freedmen must be guaranteed." Meanwhile, events in the South were stiffening Northern resolve. In Memphis, Tennessee, in May 1866, a deadly race riot broke out. White mobs, including police and firemen, rampaged through black neighborhoods for 3 days, burning churches and schoolhouses and killing dozens of black residents. In New Orleans in July, another massacre occurred when white ex-Confederates attacked black Union veterans and delegates at a black suffrage convention, leaving nearly 50 black men dead in the streets. Such atrocities underscored that without federal protection, black lives and liberties were gravely endangered. As Frederick Douglass noted, the lawless and revolutionary spirit in the South was still at large. Northern public opinion swung further in favor of a hard Reconstruction line to enforce true freedom. Thus, in June 1866, congressional Republicans took a momentous step. They approved the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This amendment fundamentally reshaped American citizenship. Its first section declared that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside, overturning the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which had denied black people citizenship. The 14th Amendment then guaranteed equal protection of the laws and due process to every citizen, aiming to ensure basic civil rights could not be stripped away by states. It also penalized states that denied the vote to any adult male citizens by reducing their representation in Congress, and it barred many ex-Confederate officials from holding public office unless Congress lifted the ban. Congress made ratification of this amendment a condition for Southern states to regain full status in the Union. President Johnson bitterly opposed the 14th Amendment, urging Southern legislatures to reject it, which all except Tennessee promptly did. This intransigence set the stage for a showdown in the 1866 congressional elections. Johnson embarked on a disastrous speaking tour dubbed the Swing Around the Circle, traveling across the North to campaign against the radical Republicans and the 14th Amendment. His appearances often devolved into undignified shouting matches. The president traded insults with hecklers, comparing radical leaders to traitors, and even suggesting the country might be better off with white men to govern without black participation. Many in the audience were appalled at the sight of a sitting president behaving so coarsely. Johnson's antics backfired badly. In the November 1866 elections, Northern voters delivered a resounding victory to the Republican Party. Radicals and moderates alike won enough seats to command two-thirds majorities in both the House and Senate, sufficient to override any presidential veto. The people had, in effect, endorsed Congress's vision for a more robust Reconstruction over Johnson's leniency. As the abolitionist Wendell Phillips exulted, Andrew Johnson's policy is buried. The nation has taken Reconstruction into its own hands. Armed with a mandate, the now radical-led Congress moved swiftly in 1867 to impose a new order on the South. In March, they passed over Johnson's veto, the first of the Reconstruction Acts. These laws dissolved the Johnson-approved governments of the southern states, except Tennessee, which had ratified the 14th Amendment and was readmitted, and placed the former Confederacy under temporary military rule. The 10 unreconstructed states were divided into 5 military districts, each commanded by a Union general. These commanders were charged with supervising the formation of new state governments based on universal male suffrage, regardless of race. In other words, Congress enabled black men across the South to vote and hold office for the first time, while temporarily excluding some leading ex-Confederates from power. Each state had to call a constitutional convention elected by both black and white voters, draft a new constitution guaranteeing black rights, and ratify the 14th Amendment. Only then could they be fully restored to the Union with representation in Congress. This bold plan, often called Radical Reconstruction or Congressional Reconstruction, was nothing less than a social and political revolution for the South. The whole fabric of Southern society must be changed, declared Thaddeus Stevens. Without this government can never be, as it has never been, a true republic. The radical reconstruction of the South. Under the bayonet of federal troops and the authority of the Reconstruction Acts, a remarkable experiment in interracial democracy unfolded in the late 1860s. In state after state, beginning with elections in 1867, millions of formerly enslaved black men cast ballots for the first time. Many were nearly bewildered by the experience. They had only heard whispers that Lincoln's Law now gave them a voice. On voting day, black voters formed lines at courthouses and polling places, often singing hymns or freedom songs as they waited. One Harper's Weekly illustration, titled "The First Vote," depicted a dignified black veteran, a blacksmith, and a laborer together dropping their ballots into the box in 1867, the pride evident on their faces. Though intimidation was widespread, black turnout was nevertheless very high wherever the army could provide protection. A white Northern observer wrote from Alabama that the freedmen voted solidly for constitutional conventions, and their zeal knew no bounds. They were voting not only for themselves, but for the promise of better lives for their families and community. These Reconstruction constitutional conventions met in 1867, 1868, and ushered in significant reforms. The new state constitutions established public school systems for the first time in Southern history, open to all, though in practice usually segregated. They guaranteed universal male suffrage, ending property qualifications that had restricted voting among poor whites as well. They did away with barbaric antebellum practices like public whipping and branding as criminal punishments. Some states forbade racial discrimination in transportation or businesses. The constitutions of states like South Carolina and Louisiana were particularly progressive, with South Carolina's 1868 Constitution declaring equality before the law and even providing for women's property rights. For the first time, black citizens helped write the fundamental laws of their states. In South Carolina, where the population was majority black delegates formed the majority at the convention. These gatherings often opened with prayer and the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner or John Brown's Body, evoking a sense of solemn mission. White conservatives sneered at these assemblies as black conventions, but one radical newspaper proudly noted that they were actually the most democratic bodies the South had ever seen, representing all the people, not just planters. By 1868, all the required new constitutions were written and approved by voters, in some cases by slender margins, amid violence. One by one, Southern states met the conditions for readmission to Congress, ratifying the 14th Amendment and embracing the new order. In June 1868, Arkansas, Florida, North Carolina, Louisiana, and South Carolina were readmitted. That summer, Georgia, Alabama, and others followed, though Georgia was later expelled again briefly for banning black legislators. The 14th Amendment was officially ratified in July 1868, becoming part of the Constitution and enshrining the principle of birthright citizenship and equal protection for future generations. By 1870, after further compliance, including ratification of the 15th Amendment, which we will soon discuss, all 11 Confederate states were back in the Union under new governments that included Republican coalitions of blacks and whites. Those new state governments, during radical Reconstruction, were groundbreaking in their diversity and achievements. For the first time in Southern history, African American men held positions of political power, from sheriffs and justices of the peace to state legislators to U.S. congressmen and senators. All told, by 1807, roughly 2,000 black men had served in public office across the South. This included about 600 in state legislatures and 16 in the U.S. Congress. In 1870, Hiram Rhodes Revels of Mississippi became the first black U.S. senator, filling the very seat once held by Jefferson Davis. At his swearing-in, observers noted the poignant symbolism of a black man occupying the seat of the former Confederate president. Revels, a pastor and educator, argued eloquently for racial equality during his term. He was soon joined by a second black senator, Blanche K. Bruce, also from Mississippi, and by representatives such as Robert Smalls of South Carolina, a war hero who had escaped slavery by piloting a Confederate ship to Union lines, and Josiah T. Walls of Florida. In state capitals, black Americans like Pinckney B. S. Pinchback of Louisiana rose to high office. Pinchback served as acting governor of Louisiana for a brief period in 1872, the first person of African descent to occupy a governor's chair. These black officials were part of the Southern Republican Party, which was a coalition of black voters who formed the majority of Republicans in many areas. Sympathetic Northern whites who moved south, called carpetbaggers by critics, and white Southern Unionists, or moderates, derisively dubbed scalawags. Although disparaged by opponents, many of these individuals were genuinely committed to building a fairer, more modern South. Together, during Reconstruction, they made significant advances. They rebuilt infrastructure destroyed in the war, repairing railroads, bridges, and public buildings. They established the first statewide systems of public education. By the early 1870s, every southern state had free public schools, though funding was often meager, and black literacy rates began to climb. For instance, in North Carolina, the Reconstruction government created a public school system that enrolled both black and white children, albeit in segregated schools, for the first time. Reconstruction legislatures also modernized laws, streamlining tax codes and outlawing brutal punishments. They fostered economic development through charters for railroads and industries, hoping to spur a new South not solely reliant on cotton. In some states, efforts were made to ensure racially fairer laws, for example, making it illegal to deny someone service in a public conveyance based on race. It's important to note that these governments faced huge challenges. They inherited states devastated by war, with shattered economies and heavy debts. The task of building schools and hospitals required raising revenue and thus higher taxes, which angered many white property owners. Additionally, rampant corruption plagued 19th century American politics in general, and the South was no exception. Some office holders, white and black, engaged in graft or cut shady deals. Opponents seized on these incidents to smear Reconstruction as corrupt. While corruption did occur, for example, the notorious railroad bonds scandal in South Carolina, modern research shows that corruption was no worse in Reconstruction Southern governments than in northern states or later Gilded Age politics. Still, tales of legislatures wasting public funds, sometimes exaggerated or fabricated, became fodder for anti-Reconstruction propaganda. Southern white elites whipped up anger by claiming that former slaves were incompetent and unfit to rule, pointing to rising state debts or taxes as evidence. They spread lurid myths of Negro misrule, though in reality black legislators proved to be, as contemporary observer Albion Tourget wrote, generally more honest and earnest than their white colleagues. Resistance and retrenchment. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan. From the moment black Americans gained political agency, a fierce white supremacist backlash grew. Secret terrorist organizations sprang up, the most notorious being the Ku Klux Klan, founded in late 1865 in Tennessee. Initially a social club for ex-Confederate soldiers, the Klan quickly morphed into a night-riding vigilante force, targeting black voters and white Republicans. Donning masks and flowing white robes to appear as ghostly Confederate spirits, Klan riders would gallop through dark countryside, spreading fear. They lashed or lynched black people who tried to vote or asserted equality, and they assassinated Republican leaders or local officials, black and white, who supported Reconstruction. "We are simply out hunting radicals," one Klansman boasted in 1868. In many areas, the Klan effectively became the armed wing of the Democratic Party, aiming to redeem the South from Republican rule and restore white dominance. The scope of violence was staggering. During the 1868 presidential election, in which Ulysses S. Grant was the Republican candidate, the KKK and similar groups, like the White Brotherhood and Knights of the White Camellia, conducted a reign of terror to suppress the black vote. In Louisiana, over 1,000 people, mostly black Republicans, were killed in the weeks leading up to the election. One massacre in Opelousas, Louisiana, in September 1868 left an estimated 200 black men dead after they tried to organize a Republican club. In Georgia, the Klan murdered or drove off so many Republican organizers that the Democratic candidate handily carried the state despite a large black population. A Georgia Freedmen's Bureau agent reported, "Nearly every midnight hears of some outrage. Men on horseback would visit black homes in the dead of night, whipping the occupants and warning them not to vote Republican again." A victim in Alabama testified that the Klansmen told him, if we did not vote as they wanted, they would kill us and throw us in the river. This terror profoundly affected black communities. Many freed people lived in constant fear once the sun went down. They organized militias or informal night patrols to guard against Klan incursions, and some slept in the woods or cane brakes when danger was especially high. Brave individuals continued to speak and vote despite threats. For example, Abram Colby, a black legislator in Georgia, was dragged from his bed and whipped nearly to death by Klansmen in 1869. When asked later why they targeted him, Colby said, "Because I was a member of the legislature and a leader of the people." He described the attack to Congress. "They said to me, 'Do you think you will ever vote another damned radical ticket?'" Colby's back bore the scars of 25 lashes, yet he survived and defiantly continued his work. The federal government, under President Ulysses S. Grant, inaugurated 1869, responded to Klan violence with the Enforcement Acts of 1870-1871. These laws, also called the Ku Klux Klan Acts, made it a federal offense to interfere with voting rights, and they empowered the president to suspend habeas corpus and send troops to suppress armed conspiracies. Grant, a former Union general determined to secure the peace, did not hesitate to use these powers. In late 1871, he sent federal marshals and troops into South Carolina after the governor reported the state was in the hands of the Klan. Hundreds of Klansmen were indicted and arrested. Some fled, others were tried, and a few even served jail time. The federal crackdown, along with the Klan's own overreach, their excessive brutality had outraged Northern opinion, succeeded in disintegrating the first Klan by 1872. White terror did not vanish, but the secret societies went temporarily quiet. A fragile calm returned, and for a moment it seemed the Reconstruction governments might function without murderous intimidation. However, white resistance took many forms beyond the Klan. By the early 1870s, paramilitary groups with more open political agendas emerged, such as the White League in Louisiana and the Red Shirts in Mississippi and the Carolinas. These groups were less clandestine. They organized openly to redeem their states from Republican rule. Wearing red shirts or other identifying garb, they intimidated black voters at polling places en masse and drove Republican officeholders from communities. Violence flared anew in brutal incidents. The Colfax Massacre of 1873 in Louisiana was one grim example. On Easter Sunday, white militiamen armed with a small cannon overran the courthouse in Colfax, Louisiana, which was being defended by black citizens and state militia. Approximately 150 black men were killed in the Colfax Massacre after they surrendered, an atrocity meant to destroy black political power in that parish. A Harper's Weekly graphic, later titled Colfax, 1873, showed the charred remains of slaughtered black men, a stark reminder of the stakes of the struggle. Federal efforts to prosecute the Colfax killers faltered when the Supreme Court in 1876 in United States versus Cruikshank threw out the convictions, ruling that the 14th Amendment's protections did not extend to private acts of violence. This decision emboldened white supremacists further, showing that even the highest court would not strongly defend black rights. The Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. Despite the setbacks and bloodshed, Reconstruction achieved constitutional changes of enduring importance. We have already seen the impact of the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolishing slavery, and the 14th Amendment, ratified 1868, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection. The third great amendment of this era was the 15th Amendment, which declared that the right to vote could not be denied by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment was passed by Congress in 1869 and ratified in early 1870. It effectively enshrined black male suffrage in the Constitution. For abolitionists and radical Republicans, the 15th Amendment was the capstone of the legal abolitionist project, securing through law what black men had been fighting for in practice since 1867. Frederick Douglass rejoiced, calling it the culmination of all that has been attempted by righteous people for the last 40 years. When the 15th Amendment was ratified in March 1870, celebrations swept black communities in the South. Huge parades and picnics were held on May 19, 1870, a day proclaimed to commemorate black suffrage. In Raleigh, North Carolina, an estimated 3,000 people, black men, women, and children, along with white Republican allies, marched with brass bands, colorful banners, and floats symbolizing liberty. One eyewitness described black veterans leading the procession, carrying the U.S. flag and a banner that read, "Equal Rights." Similar jubilant demonstrations took place in Richmond, New Orleans, Charleston, and many smaller towns. A famous 1870 lithograph titled "The 15th Amendment" captures the spirit. It depicts proud black citizens exercising their new rights, voting, attending school, getting married, farming their land, and even serving in Congress, all encircled by portraits of Lincoln, Grant, and prominent black leaders. At the center stands Liberty in a white robe, surrounded by scenes of progress, labeled with aspirations like education will prove the equality of the races. The ballot box is open to us, and liberty protects the marriage altar. This print was a visual hymn to the strides made during Reconstruction, even while cautioning that some of those freedoms would be short-lived. Notably, the 15th Amendment did not guarantee the right to hold office, nor did it mention gender. Thus, it did nothing for women's suffrage, which caused a painful split in the women's rights movement. Some activists, like Susan B. Anthony, opposed the amendment for excluding women, while others, like Lucy Stone, supported it as a necessary step for black men. Still, in the context of its time, the 15th Amendment was revolutionary. Never before had a nation that was so deeply racist in practice extended suffrage across racial lines in this way. The amendment's language was sweeping, but in implementation, it would be sorely tested in coming years. The unraveling of Reconstruction. By the early 1870s, Reconstruction had reached its high water mark and began to recede. Several factors contributed to its decline. One was the simple passage of time. As the Civil War grew more distant, Northern voters and politicians became less willing to keep up extraordinary efforts and expenditures to remake the South. Economic issues also distracted the North. In 1873, a severe financial panic and depression hit the country, causing high unemployment and hardship. Northerners grew more concerned with economic recovery than with Southern racial politics. The Grant administration, while well-intentioned on Reconstruction, became mired in scandals such as the whiskey ring and others that sapped its effectiveness and public support. And Northern racism never disappeared. Many whites who supported abstract rights for freedmen still balked at full social or political equality, and they easily grew impatient with the South's turmoil. At the same time, Southern white conservatives, calling themselves Redeemers or Democrats, grew increasingly organized and unified. They appealed to white voters' race solidarity and weariness with corruption or high taxes. Starting with states that had relatively small black populations or that had been readmitted earliest, Democrats began to win back state governments. Tennessee and Virginia were redeemed by conservative Democrats as early as 1869 to 70. Georgia followed in 1871. In these states, white majorities, or pluralities, combined with some violence or fraud, ousted the Republican coalitions. By 1873, Democrats also controlled North Carolina and Texas. The Republicans still held power in South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, and Arkansas, but they were under siege. The contested state governments often had to rely on federal troops to keep order against White League or Red Shirt insurrections. In Mississippi, the turning point came in 1875. That year, the state's Democratic Party launched a campaign known as the Mississippi Plan, which openly used intimidation to suppress black voting. Armed militias of red shirts disrupted Republican rallies and patrolled voting places. In majority black counties, white gunmen simply drove off black voters or kept them from the polls. The Republican governor appealed desperately for federal troops, but President Grant, influenced by Northern political fatigue, hesitated. The result was a Democratic landslide in Mississippi's 1875 elections, a redemption achieved through violence and fraud. The pattern was set. One by one, the remaining Reconstruction states fell. South Carolina witnessed a particularly bloody campaign in 1876, with pitched battles between red shirts and black militia in places like Hamburg and Ellington. That year, the presidential election brought the final crisis. The election of 1876 pitted Republican Rutherford B. Hayes against Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. It was one of the most disputed elections in U.S. history. Tilden, the Democrat, won the popular vote and appeared to have 184 of the 185 electoral votes needed to win. But the electoral votes of three Republican-led southern states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, were in dispute amid accusations of massive fraud and violence. In all three states, two sets of electoral returns were submitted. Republicans claimed victory through official canvassing boards, while Democrats claimed victory based on their own counts, achieved in part by suppressing many black votes. The nation teetered on the edge of constitutional chaos as winter set in. For weeks, uncertainty reigned, with talk of rival inaugurations or even renewed civil war. Finally, in early 1877, behind closed doors, leaders of both parties forged a deal known as the Compromise of 1877. The Democrats agreed not to block Hayes's inauguration, thus handing the presidency to the Republican Hayes, and in return, Hayes's allies pledged to withdraw federal troops from the last two occupied Southern state houses, South Carolina and Louisiana, effectively ending Reconstruction. Hayes also signaled he would appoint at least one Southerner to his cabinet and support federal aid for Southern railroads. Whether or not all the details were explicitly agreed to, the outcome was clear. Hayes became president, and the federal government abandoned its last efforts to enforce Reconstruction. In April 1877, the remaining Union troops were pulled out of Columbia, SC, and New Orleans, LA, and the Republican governments there collapsed as Democrats seized control. The last bastion of interracial democracy in the South fell, giving way to white Redeemer regimes. Reconstruction, as an era of active federal intervention for racial equality in the South, had come to its end. Aftermath. The promises unkept and the legacy of Reconstruction. When federal troops left, a Southern white editor triumphantly wrote, "The capital of the last carpetbag government has fallen." Across the South, Redeemers rejoiced at having redeemed their states from Negro rule. But for black Southerners, the end of Reconstruction ushered in a new era of peril and oppression. The Lassicos' gains of Reconstruction began to erode. Almost immediately, over the next 2 decades, the Jim Crow era, Southern states systematically stripped black men of voting rights through poll taxes, literacy tests, property qualifications, and outright intimidation. By the early 1900s, black voter turnout in the South was near zero in many areas. Segregation laws were enacted to enforce racial separation in schools, transportation, and public facilities. White supremacist ideology, once partially beaten back, returned in full force. The promise of 40 acres was never fulfilled. Instead, sharecropping and tenant farming kept most black families impoverished and economically dependent. In the worst reversal, an epidemic of racial terror lynchings swept the South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, enforcing white dominance through brutal violence. Yet the legacy of Reconstruction was not wholly erased. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments remained embedded in the Constitution, a sleeping giant of rights that future generations would awaken. Though nearly nullified for decades by Jim Crow practices and court decisions, these amendments provided a legal bedrock for the civil rights movement of the 20th century. For example, the NAACP in the early 1900s and later civil rights lawyers in the mid-20th century invoked the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to challenge segregation. The 15th Amendment, though circumvented after Reconstruction, formed the basis of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, when Congress finally moved, under great pressure, to enforce black voting rights nationwide. Reconstruction also left lasting institutions in African American life. Independent black churches thrived, becoming sources of community strength, education, and leadership. Black ministers like Henry McNeil Turner or Pauli Murray's forebears carried the flame of activism. Black schools and colleges founded in the Reconstruction era, such as Howard, Fisk, Morehouse, and others, continued to educate generations of African American leaders and professionals. Black political activism did not disappear. Fraternal societies, advocacy groups, and later the Niagara Movement and NAACP all traced intellectual lineage to the ideas first given form during Reconstruction. The memory of brief political power and the taste of freedom's possibilities lived on in Black folklore and family stories as an inspiration and a warning. W.E.B. Du Bois would call Reconstruction a brief moment in the sun for African Americans, one that ended too soon, but which proved the capacity of Black people to participate fully in American democracy. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery, Du Bois wrote in 1935. That melancholy summary captures the arc of Reconstruction's rise and fall. For generations after 1877, the prevailing white view of Reconstruction was harshly negative. Influential historians of the early 20th century, the Dunning School, portrayed Reconstruction as a tragic era of Negro misrule and corruption imposed on the South by vengeful Northerners and happily overturned by heroic redeemers. This view seeped into popular culture. For instance, the 1915 film The Birth of a Nation glorified the Ku Klux Klan as saviors of white womanhood and civilization. Monuments went up across the South, lionizing Confederate figures, while Black achievements during Reconstruction were ignored or derided. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, with the stirrings of the civil rights movement, that scholars like Du Bois and later Eric Foner revisited Reconstruction and reassessed it as a bold, if flawed, experiment in interracial democracy. Today, historians recognize Reconstruction as America's second revolution, or the unfinished revolution, emphasizing its significant strides toward equality as well as the violent backlash that rolled many of them back. Frederick Douglass, reflecting on Reconstruction's collapse in 1877, urged the nation not to forget the ideals for which the Civil War was fought. Speaking on Decoration Day, Memorial Day, in 1878 before a crowd in New York, Douglass acknowledged that the country was still afflicted by the painful sequences both of slavery and of the late rebellion. He reminded his audience of the principles of liberty and justice that Union soldiers died for, and he warned against abandoning those principles in the name of sectional reconciliation. Though freedom of speech and of the ballot have for the present fallen before the shotguns of the South, and the party of slavery is now in the ascendant, we need bate no jot of heart or hope, Douglass proclaimed. The heart of the nation is still sound and strong, he insisted, prophesying that eventually liberty, equality, and justice would triumph. His words carried the weight of someone who had seen slavery, seen freedom, and seen that freedom narrowed, but who still believed in the possibility of an American future true to its ideals. And indeed, nearly a century later, the descendants of those freedmen and women who endured Reconstruction's rise and fall would launch the civil rights movement, finally compelling the nation to enforce many of the rights first promised during Reconstruction. The journey from the 1860s to the 1960s was long and arduous, but the foundation had been laid by those earlier struggles. In the stillness of many southern nights, perhaps an elderly black grandmother in 1920s Mississippi would tell her grandchildren by lamplight about the time when she was a little girl and saw her father cast a vote, or when her mother learned to read at a freedmen's school. Those memories, quietly kept alive, bridged the dark years and fed the resolve of future generations to reclaim their rights. Conclusion: a history to remember. Reconstruction after the Civil War was a time of astonishing change and heartbreaking disappointment. It stands as one of the most idealistic and tumultuous periods in American history. In just a dozen years, a society built on slavery was, however briefly, remade into one nominally based on equal citizenship. Enslaved people became voters, jurors, office holders, landowners, students. America experienced its first interracial democracy, an experiment of profound importance. But the forces of reaction proved fierce. The nation, fatigued and divided, ultimately retreated from enforcing the new rights of freed people, allowing white supremacy to reassert itself in the South for nearly another century. And yet, the legacy of Reconstruction is not simply one of failure. It planted seeds of freedom that would bloom later. The constitutional amendments remain, sleeping but alive. Black Americans demonstrated indelibly their capacity for full citizenship, despite every obstacle. The public schools and colleges founded then would educate leaders who fought Jim Crow. The black church, nurtured in Reconstruction, became the spiritual and organizational bedrock of the civil rights movement. Even the concept of federal responsibility for civil rights, pioneered by the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and enforcement acts, set precedents for future federal action. In the calm of a reflective evening, one can almost hear the voices of that era carried on the breeze. The praying congregations thanking God for deliverance from bondage. The ardent debates in state capitals as black and white legislators framed new laws. The frightened whispers of a family huddled in their cabin as hoofbeats of night riders echo down the road. Reconstruction's story is complex and often sorrowful, but it is also full of courage, hope, and the striving of a people to make America live up to its professed ideals. It is a chapter of American history we remember to better understand the long journey to justice, a journey unfinished but irrevocably shaped by those 12 tumultuous years when, in the words of Frederick Douglass, liberty, law, and justice hung in the balance. More than 150 years later, as we consider the Reconstruction era in a gentle, late-hour narrative, we honor both the dream it embodied and the lessons it left behind. The dream was that a country rent by civil war could rebuild on the principles of equality and human dignity, that former slaves could become free citizens with rights respected. The lesson is that such progress, once attained, must be vigilantly guarded, for there will always be those who seek to turn back the clock. The story of Reconstruction is thus not merely a Southern story nor a black story, but an American story of democracy's fragility and resilience. It reminds us that history does not move in a straight line, but in ebbs and flows, moments of advance met by backlash. And it urges us, in the quiet of our contemplation, to take to heart the simple yet profound words of Lincoln and Douglas, to have malice toward none, but also to insist on justice first. In the end, Reconstruction's spirit survives whenever and wherever Americans strive to create a more perfect union, true to the promise of liberty and equality for all. Sources: the historical details and quotations in this narrative have been drawn from a range of primary and scholarly sources. First-hand accounts, such as the 1865 Edisto Island Freedmen's Petition, Charlotte Fortin's Diary of Teaching Freed Children, and General Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, provide contemporary insight into the era's experiences. Official documents like the Mississippi Black Code 1865, illustrate the oppressive laws instituted against freed people. The testimony of Union officers and Freedmen's Bureau agents, for instance General J. Reynolds's 1868 report on lawlessness in Texas, reveal the scale of violence that persisted. Speeches and writings of black leaders, notably Frederick Douglass's 1878 Decoration Day speech, articulate the aspirations and frustrations at Reconstruction's end. Modern historians' syntheses, like Eric Foner's work, which underpins much of the above, and archival compilations, such as the American Yawp Reader documents, have also been used to ensure accuracy and depth in portraying this pivotal period. The story of Reconstruction, as told here, rests on the foundation of these rich historical records, voices from the past that continue to speak to us calmly and clearly of struggle and hope in the quest for true freedom.